Hello and welcome to a new episode of TarGZ. And so we all see the agents that are like thinking between quotes and reasoning. I always wonder, how does it work? How does it this kind of think for real? And so today we're going to talk about that with Sara Marjanovic, PhD student at Copenhagen University. Hello, Sara, and welcome.
Hi, Luca. Thank you for having me.
Cool, Sara. Would like to introduce yourself, give us some context on your research?
Sure. So, as Lucas mentioned, I am a PhD student at the University of Copenhagen, and I'm in my final year. So, I've been working a bit on a lot of different things, mainly focused about how knowledge is acquired and whether through training or in a retrieval process, how that impacts the model's output with a bit of an interpretability focused lens. That's what I've been working on for the past few years. But what we're planning to talk about today was another article that I've been working on, which I did when I was a visiting researcher at Mila, which is a machine learning research center in Canada, in Quebec. And when I arrived there, I think I arrived like a day after DeepSeek R1 came out. And this was really exciting because it was like the first time we'd heard of these sort of reasoning models, but it was the first time that one was completely open source where you can look into the actual reasoning process, and we had an insight into the training process. So this paper was a bit of a sidestep from my previous work in that we were interested in a completely different, a very new kind of language model, and understanding how it worked. And I guess the rest of my work since that I haven't really published yet is, trying to combine some of the work that I was previously working on with this new class of model.
Okay, so your DeepSeek R1 was the first one that was kind of reasoning, or the first reasoning model, or was the first one open source?
It was the first open source one. So I think a few months prior, OpenAI had released O1.
Okay.
And OpenAI is, famously a little bit tight-lipped about how these models are made. So they released this thing that said, people realized that it was thinking for a period of time before it gave a response. They thought it probably had something to do with chain of thought, which was a prompting paradigm that had existed for a while. But we didn't have a lot of insight to what was actually going on in this thinking process. So DeepSeek R1 was the first time that we as researchers outside of OpenAI had an idea to what was going on. And now we have more and more large reasoning models that are trained in a similar process.
How did you leverage this kind of new visibility inside this reasoning model?
So we did a few different things. What we had originally hoped was that we could kind of benchmark this model's performance on a bunch of different tasks, and we could compare it to its non-reasoning version of the model, so the base language model, to determine the effect of reasoning, but we could also compare it to other reasoning models, and we could also look into the reasoning traces themselves. So because we could actually see what the model was outputting at this point, we can look into this and see, does any of the things that it's outputting actually have can we see that it maybe has an impact or is correlated at least to some other behaviors that we see in the model, and can we see some places, some room for improvement to guide future research in this area.
Okay, cool. And so how were you measuring these metrics about, you mentioned about having an impact on other behavior of the model. How were you measuring the impact?
Yeah, it's a very correlational study. So we're mainly looking at benchmarks and looking at fail cases and success cases. And oftentimes we look into the actual reasoning trace in itself to see what features that we can find in successful and failure cases.
Anything interesting there that you found out?
Yeah. So some of our main findings, I suppose, which now is maybe old news, but at the time it was more exciting, was this concept of overthinking. So we could see when we look into a model into a reasoning trace that it had a consistent pattern of how a reasoning trace was formatted. It would first define a problem, then it would think through the answer at least once, and then it would go into these re-verification cycles. And then it would, wrap up the thinking phase, decide, okay, this is the answer that I'm going to go with, and then it closes the thinking tags and it provides an answer. And what we could notice is that in a lot of cases, when we look at the cases where the model does poorly, it actually spends a very long time in this verification stage. And when you actually look at the specific text that's output, it's just like oftentimes very, very similar concepts that are reinvestigated. So we call this topic rumination because it was not able to get out of this verification cycle of like it wasn't actually diversifying what it was looking at least within the actual text that's being output.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So it was kind of looping through his thoughts.
Yeah, but it would be the exact same, oftentimes the exact same text. Like, oh, so that doesn't make sense. So maybe it's X. Okay. Oh, but that doesn't make sense. So maybe it's X.
So
and it could
was
repeat
really
that
a loop.
multiple times.
Okay.
It's very much a loop. And we even measured this rumination rate where we could see, okay, out of how much is it just verbatim repeating itself? And we took like a 5 gram, like an n gram, but 5 tokens that are repeated after each other. How many times do we see the same 5 tokens repeat after each other? And we could see that it could jump up to like 30% is a repetition of the same 5 words in a row.
Oh, wow.
Which, if you think about it, that's in the same amount. I think if you think of 5 of the same words repeated in a row, that's a fairly strict measure of repetition.
Yeah. Definitely, yes. And did you notice some kind of behavior that made the agent work at its best?
That's a good question. I think we were mainly focusing on things that indicated some failures as opposed to things that included that were markers of success. What I would imagine as the reverse of this is if it tried to keep it concise and made different considerations.
Okay.
So when I verified it gave a better restructuring of the problem. For any math problem, there are different ways that you could look at the same problem.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And do you notice?
We found another thing that it was actually pretty good at. When we looked at a context adherence benchmark, so sometimes if you provide some text to the model and you say, answer this question based off this text, and in the text it has something that contradicts what the model knows to be true.
Okay, yeah.
The model was pretty good at adhering to this context in the text, and you could see it in the thought trajectory that it was aware that this was incorrect, but it's doing what the person wants. So this was also like something that was quite interesting, I guess, a year and a half ago, because people were really interested in, okay, if we provide this fake context to a model and the model adheres to it, is the model getting fooled or what is it doing? And it was a bit more clear that, or at least the model directly stated that it knows that this is fake, but it is doing it for this reason. And it was fairly good at adhering to this context that we provided.
Oh, okay, interesting. Any kind of, weird behavior coming out from this reasoning kind of, chain of thoughts or whatever, something that you'll say, okay, this is just weird that you found out about the agent thinking, let's say, or let's call it thought process of the agent.
Yeah, there was one fun task, one of the chapters of the paper. So we looked at a lot of different tasks, and one of them was the sort of visual world modeling task, designed by 2 of our co-authors, Xinghan Liu and Benno Kreuer. And they asked R1 to create these ASCII images.
Okay.
So it would start by asking it to create an ASCII image of a dog or create an ASCII image of something else. And then eventually we made it more difficult. So we asked it to create like ASCII images of hybrids because we determined that it's seen an ASCII image of a dog or something. Yeah. So we asked it to make a dog shark. And then finally it was asked to create like scenes from a video clip. So multiple things that were connected to each other. And that was a pretty fun task. It's a bit difficult to evaluate because you need to hand go through it and determine if this is a good thing or not. But when we looked at the reasoning traces, what we could see is like the models didn't iterate on a draft.
Okay.
So I imagine if I were to ask you to create an ASCII dog.
Sure.
I don't know how good you are at ASCII images, but I imagine that you would first try to create like the shape of a dog and add some details or something over time, right? Yeah. You'd iteratively develop on a draft. And in the reasoning trace, the text suggests like it is building upon a draft, but when you're actually looking at the ASCII images it generates after each other, there is not really a relationship between one step and the next step,
Okay.
which kind of gives an idea. There are a few different ways that you can solve a problem. You can iterate on something, or you can do like stepwise decomposition. And it seems like it's doing the stepwise decomposition, but it's not really putting things together.
Oh, okay.
And oftentimes, when we saw this final answer, it wouldn't actually look like or contain any of the things that were mentioned in this reasoning trace, which also suggests some unfaithfulness, which is another line of research that a lot of people have been looking into recently, this unfaithfulness of the trajectory. I thought this was a fun task and a really interesting way that this unfaithfulness was shown, but also this failure to problem solve in a specific way that was important for this task.
Yeah. What were the main outcomes of your research when it comes to this specific analysis of the thinking of the LLM?
Yeah, so we were able to find a lot of issues and open questions available for future research. We didn't do a super in-depth investigation to all of these different things, but we were able to showcase a lot of things that are interesting for future work, for further exploration. So we were able to, one, show this issue of overthinking, and that overthinking is often these exact ruminations or exact repetitions of things that were previously investigated before. We were able to show that, a lot of these tokens are actually not so useful. So even with like 50% of the reasoning trajectory, the model still retains like 90% of its original accuracy, which shows that there's not a lot of benefit to using all of this tokens. We were also able to show that, the failures in one kind of thinking. And we were also able to show some other things in different investigations as well. Like, we were able to show this sort of the safety concerns with these reasoning models.
Okay.
We were able to use DeepSeek R1 to jailbreak other models that were otherwise previously very, very safe. And in the recent year, at least since we first released this paper, a lot of these things have still been investigated further, and they've been shown to be larger problems. So there's been a lot of work in how we can reduce overthinking. How can we detect it as it's happening? How can we make our models more safe? So I think it helped to create sort of a baseline understanding of these reasoning models as they came out, and to hopefully help guide some of the research that has since been going on this type of models.
Yeah, exactly. I'm curious. If you know, of course, because my understanding is that you are now researching on something different, but what was the evolution? So after, you published your paper 1 year ago, 1.5 years ago, whatever, but your research kind of, I guess the agents evolved in this time, right? Because things are moving super fast. So do you know what has been the evolution of the research on that side about thinking? And you already mentioned kind of, other thing, overthinking, and the other issue you found out, but is there any kind of, let's say, next step that happened after your research?
Agents have become a big thing. So people have been using these models to interact with the world around them. That's been a big thing that's been happening in the area since. But I will say a lot of the things that we researched are still very, very relevant. It's only been I think half a year since this paper has been published.
Okay.
So even though we were writing it about a year ago.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
It's, I would say a lot of these things that I've mentioned, like the reducing overthinking, ensuring safety of these models, especially now that we're releasing them into the wild. I would say probably the thing that I feel that these models have been used more for is, acting independently, doing their own, interacting with the world, retrieving information from the web, running tools, and also interacting with each other. So having multiple agents communicate with each other or doing the same task at once and then combining their results. I feel like that's been sort of the move of the last maybe 6 months. Yeah. And I would say that these things are still things that are very much impacted by, overthinking, the safety concerns and everything as well. So.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's the direction the research and the industry has taken, I guess. So, yeah. Well, Sara, I don't have any other question for you. Thank you very much for coming here and share your research. And yeah, it was super, super interesting to, go a bit kind of deeper on this kind of thinking process of agents.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Luca.
Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Sara. And thank you very much for listening, and see you at the next episode of TarGZ.